Hello, everybody. It's been a little while. If you are a subscriber here on my YouTube channel, I want to say thank you, and I want to let you guys know that the channel is changing a little bit. If you're still interested in my takes on movies, what I'm looking to do is to use this channel with the small following I've gathered here to still talk about movies, but in a more long format. So, for anybody unaware, at the beginning of the year, I started a podcast with my brother Devin, who's here with me, and the podcast is called Watch More Movies. The goal of the podcast is simple. It was to give us a reason to watch more movies that we've never seen before. So some of these, like the ones today, are new release films. Some of them are classics, maybe some from a few years ago. We jump into different genres. We have a different theme each month that we do. But essentially, every episode of the podcast, we talk about a movie that at least one of us is seeing for the first time. So you can listen to this weekly on any podcast platform, but I will be moving forward uploading the videos here on this YouTube channel as well. That's what's going to be on this YouTube channel moving forward. So for anyone that has been with me on this journey so far, thank you. If this is your first video, thanks for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about the Fear Street trilogy on Netflix.
So let's jump into it. We're going to talk about all three of them. We'll probably talk about them separately, non-spoilered, and then when we go into spoilers, it's just going to be a whole mess jumping back and forth, I'm sure. So, Josh, you want to start it off with 1994?
Yeah, so I do. We are going to go in order of how they released, but before we actually jump into the films themselves, I wanted to start with a little bit of background just because the format of these movies is a little bit different than your typical movie release. So when I first heard about the film, it was with the trailer that they released probably a couple months ago at this point. And they advertised that they were going to be releasing these Fear Street movies as a film trilogy event on Netflix. 3 full movies released 1 week apart from each other for a period of 3 weeks. And they were not anthology movies. They all were connected. They were all the same story, but at the same time, they were all their own movies as well. And they even went as far as to announce what each movie was, as far as 1994, 1978, and 1666. So I felt the marketing was extremely well done from Netflix, and without even getting to what the material is yet, I thought just from the perspective of how they were releasing the film, how they went about making this, that was the main reason I was interested. Not even that the films looked interesting or the source material was interesting. Not saying that it wasn't, we'll get to that, but just the marketing aspect of releasing this horror trilogy. I hadn't really ever seen anything like that.
Yeah, it's definitely something very pleasing and nice to see that just something brand new, especially on a streaming platform. Like streaming as is still new. I can't even say I grew up with it, and I'm 20 years old. Like it's just in the past 10 years maybe that it's really been the hip new thing, and just to see that there's just new ways of that directors, movie companies and everything can just find a way to bring new life to something that's so new as a streaming platform itself. Um, I didn't all One thing I do want to say is though I did not see any of the marketing. I don't know if they had trailers for it on YouTube or if they were just advertising it on Netflix before it came out. But I honestly, the past couple months, I've been overwhelmed with how much shows and movies that I've been having to keep up with from Disney Plus having the last 3 Marvel shows the last couple of months or more than a couple of months, 3 or 4 months, and then I have Hulu, Netflix, what is it, Amazon Prime, which I have a bunch of stuff on there as well. So there's just so many things that I'm getting caught up with, and I'm missing all this new stuff that's going on.
Yeah, it definitely feels a little bit like with the pandemic, at least where we live in the United States, coming a little bit to the end with vaccinations and everything. Everything that was delayed is now coming out, and then also new stuff that was able to be made during the pandemic as well. So we've had this dry spell for the last 18, 16 or so months, and now everything's hitting us kind of all at once, and throughout the rest of the year it's going to be like that, and maybe even bleed into next year as well. So I felt the same way. There's a bunch of stuff that I've missed. But for me, they did release the trailer online, so I saw it online. That's what caught my interest. But I'll be completely honest, getting to the actual source material, if I hadn't, and I just went on Netflix, one day, and I saw it on the homepage there, I probably would have been just as interested just seeing it on Netflix. So Fear Street is a book series from the famous author R.L. Stine, more famous for his kids' books, the Goosebumps books, which also have had adaptations. But this was kind of in the same vein as Goosebumps as far as being a kid's book. I never read them. I only read Goosebumps myself, but I was aware of Fear Street. I was aware the series existed. However, what really caught me, again in the trailer when I first saw it, is that these movies were being adapted, but as teen slashers rated R. So it was, again, kind of unique in taking something that originally was for kids, or maybe young teenagers, and now fully going with an R rating. Not just bumping it up a little bit to PG-13, but no, just going full R. I don't know who was able to make that decision, if it was R.L. Stine himself or if it was someone at Netflix, but that, again, was something that really got me interested.
And a question I had that I really didn't ponder on too much when I did see that the first one came out a couple weeks ago, are there ratings for books? I don't think that there are. If I could stand corrected, but people can write slasher books, and anybody, that you probably won't find them in your school library, but
Yeah.
anyone can go into a library or wherever books are and just pick up a book and be like, this is like really graphic. But obviously it's pen and paper, and it's, I guess it's kind of hard to put a rating on it. Do you know if there's any sort of ratings for
Yeah, I don't know a ton about books.
text?
Yeah, I don't know a ton about books. I don't think there is, but I think basically what you said, it's all going to be about what section it's in and where it's sold, more so. But I don't think there's like an MPAA or anything like that, like there is for movies and video games. I could be wrong as well, but I don't think so.
Yeah, but that just is what made it so interesting, is that like you can take a book that, and especially with these, like, I guess you could try to make it like some TV-14 TV show, or throw it on Netflix as TV-14, and like take a lot of the stuff out and still go with it, but that does do a lot of discredit to the author of the book or the book series in general, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just reading here on the Wikipedia. I thought this was interesting, kind of back to what we were talking about. So these movies were made by Churnin Entertainment, and they were developed with 20th Century Fox, 20th Century Studios. They were actually filmed all at the same time between March and September of 2019. Originally, they were going to come out theatrically, I would assume all at the same time. It says for June of 2020. And then obviously were, pulled because of the pandemic. So that's interesting. I thought this was a Netflix thing all the way. But this was actually already made and ready for theatrical release. Had the pandemic not happened, that would have been a very interesting theatrical release, to see 3 movies all released like that. Only other thing I can really think of is maybe like the Grindhouse double feature. I know back in the day they used to do like something with horror films where they released like 8 of them all at the same time, but I don't think any of those are really on the level production wise of these Fear Street movies. And then because of Disney's purchase of Fox, Churnin Entertainment then ended that distribution deal with Fox because they no longer existed, and they ended up giving the distribution to Netflix over the last summer, and then obviously they got released on Netflix. So that wasn't even the original purpose. That's also very interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think that would have been pretty crazy to see if they did release all 3 of them at the same time, or even if they did it like week after week. Like, just how many people would be that like devoted to movie theaters to actually go and see it. Also, think about the money you're spending. Like, yeah, you're paying anywhere from $10 to $15 for Netflix, but you pay $15 for a ticket at the movies, plus another
Yeah.
15-20 dollars, to be at the movies and eat and drink. So definitely a lot of dough they would have been rolling in, but how many people would, you know, devote that time and money to that is also a question that I'd really like answered. Especially with the just the scarcity of movie theaters, like their future in general now. And but I definitely think you know it was a reasonable and safe route for them to get a deal with Netflix and go this route.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, like so many things with the pandemic, something now that we'll never know how it would have gone. And I don't see this type of thing being a thing for theaters, moving forward. Because this was released on Netflix, I don't think anyone's going to look at this and be like, oh, let's do that for theaters. So that would have been interesting. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. But I did still enjoy the Netflix release in the three, weeks back to back. Like,
I just over the past like month or two, I've learned that a lot of things have been, were like movies and TV shows were filmed like right before the pandemic basically started, and it's crazy that like whether it was because they just didn't finish or they just wanted to wait to like see what happened to put it out, but just there's a lot of stuff that like was finished and done right before the pandemic and has yet to see the light of day because they don't know what to do basically.
yeah, I think people sometimes forget the lag time with making movies. A lot of times a movie gets filmed, at least a year before it's released. So, in a situation like this with the pandemic, you had all those movies. A Quiet Place 2, for example, was within days of releasing. Mulan had already had its world premiere. These movies were planned for the summer. Those all got pushed, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's this whole batch of films that were made or at least filmed in 2019, early 2020 that weren't even on a slate yet, weren't even planned for release yet, and we just never heard about them because they just held off. So this is one of those examples, and I think that just adds to how busy the next year and a half or so is going to be, because you have coming from all angles. You have the movies, the new movies that are going to be made. You're going to have the movies that were supposed to come out last year that got delayed, and then the movies that were made right before the pandemic that didn't get a release date. So there's just I'm not complaining.
I feel like that might also put pressure on movie studios to go towards the streaming route because they might not have an option. They might not have that blockbuster weekend slot available for their movie now because
Yeah.
another movie paid more money or whatever it is to take that place. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, and one last thing, like I just thought, like just this past month, I think, just uh, like there's so with the new like phase of Marvel and everything, like how many movies just one movie studio plans to release in a year, and then and the year after that, not even TV shows, but just movies. They want like 4 or 5 movies a year, and obviously those are they're gonna try to get those at like the perfect times of the year where people want to go out to the movies. So I feel like it's gonna be a dogfight between some movie studios.
Yeah, I mean, the schedule crowding at the theater was already a thing before the pandemic. It's going to be insane, but I think all studios have leaned into the streaming, whether it's selling to a Netflix or an Amazon, or if they're just having their own service, like HBO did for Warner Brothers and Paramount Plus now. So that's definitely going to be a piece of it. Are you ready to jump into this first one?
Yes.
All right, so if you haven't listened to our podcast before, or just a reminder if you have, we're going to do spoiler-free thoughts on the films first. So if you haven't seen any of the Fear Street films, you can continue watching or listening. And then at the end of that, we will give each of the three films in this case a rating out of 10 and whether or not we would recommend them. And then once we've done all of that, we will jump into spoiler thoughts on the entire trilogy. So if you've already watched the films, or if you don't care, you're not going to watch them, then you can check out this whole episode. If not, you can stop at that point. We'll give you a spoiler warning at that time, and you can come back to finish it if you want to go check them out. So starting with Fear Street Part 1, 1994. It was directed by Lee Janiak, and it stars I'm going to try my best, Kiana Mederi, Olivia Scott Welch, Benjamin Flores Jr., among others. Maya Hawke is also in the film. A lot of people would know her from the last season of Stranger Things that came out over 2 years now at this point, which is pretty crazy. And it was actually the same director, Lee Janiak, of all 3 films. So that stays consistent, and so does the cast for the most part, whether they play the same roles or even different roles, and that as we'll talk about. But starting off with Fear Street Part 1, 1994, it does have an 83% on Rotten Tomatoes, certified fresh, and a 65% audience score. The critics' consensus is that Fear Street Part 1, 1994 kicks off the trilogy in a promising fashion, honoring the source material with plenty of retro slasher appeal. Devin, we had a brief conversation about this movie like a week ago when we saw each other, and my thing coming away from this movie that I said to you is I felt like watching it, it did really have a lot of those vibes of the 90s slasher genre. And we'll jump into what's good and what's bad about that, but that was definitely my biggest takeaway, is more than any other horror movie I can remember, this reminded me the most of, Scream or New Nightmare or those kind of early to late 90s horror films. Obviously, that's what they were going for.
Yeah, the one thing that surprised me is that I feel like it really didn't focus on the actual like killer aspect of it. It was a lot more like, obviously right away, you kind of like get a tiny bit of lore for the story. You kind of meet the characters, you know who the main character is, and when it jumps from there, it doesn't pay a lot of attention to like the slashers, killers in the movie. It just focuses on the kids that are in the movie and what they're doing, what their plan is, and everything. I feel like with movies like Scream or, obviously classics like Michael Myers and Jason, it follows the killers. And although it does give time and follow like the characters, them running away, them trying to, find places to hide and stuff. But I felt like this movie, it was really about the kids' journeys trying to figure out what to do, really.
Yeah, and just to give a brief plot synopsis of the film. So you have the main character of Dina, and Dina lives in a town called Shadyside. And Shadyside is this town where all these terrible things happen. And right next to Shadyside is Sunnyvale, and Sunnyvale is just like the opposite of Shadyside. It's all nice. Devin, I don't know if you've seen Parks and Rec, but it's basically the same thing there.
I have not, and I've really been wanting to watch it, but
okay. There's a town in Parks and Rec that's like right next to Pawnee, which is the main town in the show, and I think it's called Eagleton. And it's kind of the same dynamic. You have Pawnee, this like beaten down town, and then you have Eagleton, who benefits off of their tragedies and troubles and is this really nice town for upper class people. And that show, obviously, it's played for comedy and laughs, but in this horror movie, it's more played off of in a horror way, where there's all of these tragedies happening in Shadyside over the years, and somehow Sunnyvale seems to be benefiting off of this, being the nicer town of the two. So after one of these tragedies happens in the town of Shadyside, basically Dina and her brother and a couple of her friends get into a pretty sticky situation. It's hard to really go any further than that without, getting into spoilers. So that's really where I'll leave it. But there's a tragedy that happens at the beginning of the movie. And then, as Devin alluded to, there seems to be a killer on the loose. So that's basically where we'll leave it, and from there it picks up a lot of those tropes of the slasher, teenage slasher genre. And like we said previously, this, just like all the films, has an R rating. So let's start there. I felt that the R rating was absolutely necessary when it came to the language and the kills. Both, I think, would have been more cringe or not as good if it was PG-13, and it wasn't overdone. I didn't think the gore or the language or the sex or anything like that was overdone in the movie. I think it was realistic, especially with the dialogue of how teenagers talk, and it didn't come off as a bunch of adults trying to write a movie about teenagers. It kind of had that Stranger Things feel to me of being a little bit more realistic.
Yeah, one thing that I think is funny with that, like especially just that statement that you just brought up with, like it sounds like older people are trying to write like a younger, dialogue, and I find what works best is when these older people, however old they could be 25, whatever, try to write a movie like this and do a good job like this. They're just writing normal dialogue. Like, yeah, they might throw in a couple like slang terms or that, but that's just like something like as common as like the slang cool. Like they
Hmm.
don't try to you know like dive deep in their bag of like knowledge of like young slang and try to pull it out. That's when it becomes cringe because
Yeah.
you pull out something that's like, oh, sick, and it's like, yeah, no one like really says that anymore. So I feel like when it like plays off really nice is when they just try to stick to what they know, and when they try to dive deep, that's when it becomes cringy. And really the only time it really ever, I would say, works like the best is if, someone from that generation is writing about it, because, you know, they know we know what was slang and all that stuff back then. But um I feel like the rating was fine. I mean, I don't think there was a ton. I mean, I swear all the time. I don't watch that many horror movies with like a lot of gore in it and stuff, but like them swearing, didn't even cross my mind. I
Hmm.
just, heard that, and these weren't like, it wasn't like Stranger Things where these are like, sixth graders, seventh graders. Like
Hmm.
these, most of the kids in the movie were like in high school, even if they were like freshman, sophomore, whatever it was, so that didn't really bother me. But the gore, I would say they didn't overdo it at all. But the, you know, those times where it did have those really slasher moments, they definitely did a good job. Is like all I can think to say is like they really didn't overdo it to where it's like, Tarantino blood and guts are flying everywhere. But when they hit the execution, it was like very well done.
Yeah, I would agree. And to continue with what I liked about the film, I think that the score in the soundtrack was very well done. That might be one of the things that was something that really stuck out with this individual film in the trilogy. Really liked the score and the soundtrack, and was also just very surprised by just the production value and how well made it was. At the time, I thought it was just a Netflix movie, but even taking that away from it, um, it being, like the editing and the cinematography and things. I'm not saying it's not an A24 film or anything, but I'm just saying it was much higher production quality than I would have expected from this type of film. And anytime I see that, I want to give it credit because it's like, even when you're watching a film that you don't like or you're not that interested in, if it has that technical aspect that you can appreciate, it helps you get through the movie a little bit more, in my opinion. I've come across some movies where I was not interested in it at all, but I'm like, wow, I can at least appreciate how nice this looks or how well this was shot. And so I got to give it credit for that too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And let's just picture this as like it was its own standalone movie, like there wasn't sequels to it and everything. I wasn't too like blown back by it. I wasn't like in awe or anything. I think really the two things that made this a movie to where I could possibly watch it again and I enjoyed the first time watching it, I was like, yeah, okay, that was a good movie, was the script. The script was pretty solid, and the cinematography was also pretty solid. There really weren't any flaws with it in anything. It was enjoyable to watch, and I think if either of those things were just a little worse or a little less, I think it would definitely, would leave a bad taste in my mouth.
Hmm.
Uh, just because it wasn't anything, like I said, I'm not a big slasher horror movie guy. So watching this movie, it wouldn't really, leave an impression on me.
Yeah. And then another thing I enjoyed about all three films, but this one in particular being the first one, stuck out to me is, it does have sequels to set up, and it's very open about that. So it has a lot of lore that it needs to talk about, and it has some work in setting that up for the future two movies. And I think it does it well. It doesn't do it to where it's beating you over the head most of the time it's done in a way that you believe, like, oh, it's just these characters coming across this information. It doesn't feel like it's being shoved down your throat, like, watch out for this in the next movie, you know. Most of the time it works. And then also, with that being said, kind of in the same vein, it doesn't feel bogged down. That phrase seems like it has a very negative connotation, but what I mean is, a lot of times with horror now, it always has to have some type of underlying metaphor or theme, and like, that's great when it's done extremely well, right? That's great. Like films like Get Out or Hereditary that have this underlying theme, or or real life thing that it's talking about, and it's using the horror genre, to tell that story. That's awesome. But so many times with horror, I feel like it wants to be Get Out or it wants to be Hereditary, so it tries that, and it just doesn't work. This movie doesn't have those ties. Like, it's just a movie about like teenagers getting killed, and that's it, right? So it's just like it's just able to have fun, and it explains that lore and all of those things that have to do with Fear Street very well, but it's not also like trying to tell a different story, if that makes sense. It sticks to what it is. It doesn't take itself too seriously, in my opinion. It's just the first time in a while that I was like, wow, I really enjoyed this simple teenage slasher that I don't have to think about or anything like that. Sometimes those movies are great, but sometimes I just want to be able to enjoy something for what it is. It's just a bloody, teenager slasher film.
Yeah, so and I don't remember. Well, I don't know if you remember when we talked about it about like a week or two ago about watching the first one. That I didn't even know it was a trilogy. I didn't know more were coming out, and I definitely didn't know. I definitely didn't know that it was going to be for the next 2 weeks. These were going to be releasing, and I'm actually really glad that I didn't have any of that knowledge going into this, because when I did watch it, I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't looking for all the backstory. I wasn't looking for the cliffhangers or questions that, like, I should have going into the next movie and the next one after that. The last thing I would say that I enjoyed is that they did definitely find a new, like, new creative way to take the slasher film in, and I really appreciate that. Not only with the story of the slasher killer and what the characters do. They're not just running away and hiding, but also the killer itself. It's not this mystique being that's out to kill people, or just this crazy serial killer. It's really mysterious in its motives, and just also what it is in general. Like what type of creature being that it is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I enjoyed all of the supernatural elements of the film. I guess I'll just leave it at that until we talk in spoilers. I enjoyed all of that, and like I said, with the lore, I think the things it sets up in this movie, it does really well. And obviously, it's based off of books that were written a while ago, so it has that advantage. It's not like it has to make all these things up. It has that source material. I think it uses the source material pretty well. So jumping into some things I didn't really like about this one, the first one, individually, when it came to the performances of the cast, I didn't really. It's not that any stuck out to me as bad with this one. That's not the case. But at the same time, there wasn't anything that stuck out to me as like a memorable performance. The only one that would really come to mind would be Benjamin Flores Jr., who plays the little brother Josh. Totally not biased because of the name. I did enjoy his performance, but again, even that one, it wasn't extraordinary or anything. It was just the only one that stuck out to me as like he made me laugh a lot, and I cared about his character. I wanted him to survive. As for everyone else, I thought they were below average to average. They for the most part, a lot of them, they were able to play their roles. They're pretty simple, flat characters for the most part in this one. And there was a few cringe dialogue scenes, a few kind of overdramatic scenes where the performances I didn't think were that great. So that doesn't really affect how I feel about the film, because it is just like a teenage slasher, right? So it's like they're setting up some of these characters to die. There's also 2 follow-up films to get deeper into the characters that survive. So not a huge negative for me, but that is how I felt about it.
But I was, I was pleasantly surprised with this movie. I'm not sure exactly how I found out about it, if it was just trending on Netflix, which is something I like. They have the little trending thing. But I feel like that's probably what happened. I clicked on it and, just started watching it and enjoyed it. I would also say that my favorite character was the little brother as well. Just because I felt like he had the most character to him. Like, obviously I don't want all the characters in the movie to be like wacky and ridiculous, especially when it's like kind of a serious movie. But, all the other characters basically played their role in the movie of who they were. And I like the little brother. I felt like he was, the most out there. And, when he was on the screen, whatever he was doing, like he had my attention. So I appreciate that.
That's fair. So you want to give a rating first for the film?
Yeah, I'd say this film out of the three is probably my least favorite. So I gotta be careful what I rate them. I'd probably give this a 6.5 out of 10.
We don't do halves here.
I think that 3 stars. No, I want to give it a 7, but I just with it being in the trilogy, I kind of got to group them all together and rate them equally. So I feel like that's as far as how it goes, 6.5.
So a 6. We rounded down. Okay, so yeah, I feel differently. There are things I don't like about the movie, like I said, but nothing stuck out as a huge flaw or anything that was like, wow, I really didn't like that. And I also appreciated, like I said, how the film doesn't take itself too seriously, has a good time, and we'll talk about it in spoilers, but there were a few moments where I was genuinely shocked at the decisions they made in this film, especially knowing that it was going to be a trilogy. With that all being said, even if you took this movie out of the trilogy just on its own as the first film, I think I would definitely watch this movie again around Halloween time. If there's ever a physical media release, I would definitely buy this. It was something I enjoyed quite a bit, and I am someone who's a fan of the horror genre, but I'm also a very big critic of the horror genre because I'm a fan of it, and I'm usually pretty tough on it. But with this one, I really did thoroughly enjoy it. So I would give it a 7, but it's a very strong 7. It's almost an 8. It might become an 8. I just have to see how it ages over time, because I feel like with it being part of this trilogy, it might feel like a commitment if I ever want to go back and watch it. It's like, oh, do I have to go back and watch the entire trilogy? I would be interested to see how it stands up on its own as a film, this individual one, over time. But yeah, I would give it a 7. So that's where we're going to leave that one for now. We're going to go back to spoilers for all 3 films once we're finished. So let's go ahead and jump into Fear Street Part 2, which is Fear Street Part 2 1978. This film has an 89% certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, so it's a bit higher than the first one there. Also, 82% audience score, so a higher audience score than the first. And the critics' consensus is that it's a smart and subversive twist on slasher horror. It shows that summer camp has never been scarier thanks to stellar performances from Sadie Sink, Emily Rudd, and Ryan Simpkins, who were the main actors of that film. Again, of course, the director, Lee Janik, same director for all 3 films, like we already said. So this film takes us back in time to 1978 to a summer camp where Sunnyvale and Shadyside campers are there. And for the most part, the movie really focuses on the camp counselors, the teenagers of the camp. I guess there are children there, but I think I only see children in the movie like twice. So it really does not focus on the children at all. It's the camp counselors it's focusing on. And in a lot of ways, it takes you back to that typical 80s Friday the 13th slasher of, just a bunch of teenagers hooking up. most of them are like flat characters that are, this one's a bully, this one's a bitch, right? Like it's just very like typical. This one's the rebel, you know. It's just like very typical characters for the most part. And it's really just a, for me, it was a very standard down the line. Hey, do you remember late 70s to early 80s slashers? This is going to be one of those. And I feel like just like with the first one, in a lot of ways it does succeed. However, I felt with this one, there were definitely shortcomings that I'll get into. But overall, let's talk about positives first. Devin, how did you feel about the film? What were some things you liked about it?
I thought this movie was very clean. It had a very simple premise. You know, it was just very easy for me to wrap my head around. You know, I'm gonna try not to jump back and forth too much, but with the first movie, you know, this one is your, I would say, your basic slasher film as well. Maybe a little more basic, and I felt like it was a lot easier to wrap my head around what was going on, and you know what the intentions were. You know, what, it sets it up very fast, and it's like, okay, this is what they're, you know, the end goal is. This is what they're trying to get to. This is the goal that they're trying to achieve, and I appreciated that, and I felt like all the characters did a fantastic job, or all the actors did a fantastic job. Um, the one thing that really pissed me off was I could not tell, and I no, try not to do spoilers here, but I could not tell who a certain person was, and there was the redheaded girl, Sadie Sink, um,
Ziggy.
playing Ziggy, and I don't want to say Sharia, uh, Sheila, playing Sheila, or yeah, playing Sheila, and I kept mixing the two people up, and I thought it was Ziggy, and my wife thought it was the other person. You really don't find out, like, kind of, I guess, like who it is until the end of the movie, but that just like confused me the whole time.
As far as things that I liked, I do think that Sadie Sink as Ziggy did a good job. Also, the Emily Rudd, who plays her sister Cindy, I thought they both did pretty well. I would say that their performances were stronger than any of the performances I saw in the first movie. Also, Ted Sutherland, who plays Nick Good in the movie, kind of like the love interest of Ziggy, also I thought did a pretty good job.
Would she be related to Paul Rudd?
I don't think
Emily
There's a
Rudd?
very good chance, I guess. Um, you can look into that while I talk. So, um,
Well, I was just thinking yesterday, or last night we were watching Endgame, and my wife asked me, she's like, "Does Paul Rudd have a daughter or wife?" I think he has a daughter, and I was like, I don't know.
another thing about this film is that because it's in the middle of the trilogy, there's still the lore there. There's still some setting up that they have to do, but it really benefits from being the middle one. It has the least responsibility when it comes to carrying the overall story because it's the bridge between the first and the third one. So it's really able to tell its own story and be very simple. It takes the lore that was set up in the first one and basically utilizes it. It was like, hey, you just learned this last week with this movie. This is what it looks like in practice, right? And then there's a little bit of lore set up, and then it's like, now the third movie is going to be the big, here's what's going on, you know what I mean? So it benefits from that because it doesn't have that responsibility. It's able to focus more on character and able to focus more on scares and kills and all those types of things. With that being said, there's a character in this movie, Ryan Simpkins, who plays Alice in the movie. Nothing against her personally, but I hated that character and I hated the performance. And every single time she was on screen, it was basically ruined for me. And it was a real downer because I mean, it's rare that a character is so bad that it like takes down the score or affects my experience watching a movie. You really have to be like the main character for that to be the case. But this was one of those rare scenarios where I felt like a supporting character with a good chunk of time in the movie negatively affected me. So that was something. And I also felt like I found myself waiting for the movie to get going and then like get really good, and it just never did. And I think it's because it was relying on the third film. So this one, to me, out of all three of them, felt the least like it needed to be a movie. It was still a fun time. I still enjoyed it while I was watching it, but I would never go back and rewatch this one on its own. A lot of it just feels like a C tier Friday the 13th film, like down to the killer in the movie, the character, like all of that. It just really just feels like, hey, you remember Friday the 13th? Here's this. And like, you could say that about the first one was Scream, but I felt like at least the first one was its own film with just some shades of Scream in there. This one just felt like a bad Friday the 13th sequel. Or ripoff, or whatever you'd like to say. But the performances of the two main characters was enough to get me through it, and still everything I said about the first film when it comes to the production quality stays the same here. Good editing, good special effects, the kills are good when they happen, all of those types of things I enjoyed about the film. So I'll go ahead with my rating first on this one. I would give this one a 4 out of 10. It's not one that I would recommend on its own as a film, and that's how I'm doing these individual ratings. As a standalone film, I would not recommend this, but there was definitely some stuff in it that I enjoyed.
So, while I didn't really care for the aspect of this film, I thought that was pretty bland, and especially just the kills weren't that satisfying. I really enjoyed, you could say, the lore aspect of this movie, and it could have literally just been that, like, you know, how the Two Towers was just them walking to their destination. Like, the second movie could have just been all lore based around, like, you know, I don't know if it's a spoiler, though, like, if I just say, like, you know, them, the witch, basically, like, the lore about the witch. But if that is a spoiler, you can take it out. But I feel like it could have just been about that, and I would have, you know, enjoyed it just as much, if not more. I felt like the slasher aspect of it was like, hey, this is still a slasher film, and, you know, that's why they put that in there. And it was kind of like, I guess, an origin story for, you know, that slasher, that killer. But overall, I really did enjoy what they did with the lore, so much so that I liked this movie better than the first one. So I would have to give this one an 8 out of 10.
All right. Well, with that being said, let's move on to the third and final one here. Fear Street Part 3, 1666. This one, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, certified fresh, 82% audience score, so the highest of the three when it comes to the tomato meter. And the critics' consensus for this one is that it sends the slasher series back in time for a trilogy concluding installment that caps things off on a screaming high note. I'll just start off and say that I agree with that consensus when it's talking about the screaming high note, meaning that I enjoyed the second half of this movie a hell of a lot more than I enjoyed the first half of this movie. So that's where I'll start with my thoughts. What about you?
Yeah, I would say, I guess I agree with the consensus. I feel like Rotten Tomato consensus are always kind of alluding, and like you can't really like figure out exactly what they're talking about sometimes. But I would say, like, I have to agree with what they're saying in my own thought process of what they're saying, because I did like this movie more than the other two. I liked it the most out of the three. Which is good, you know. With a trilogy, you don't want it to get worse as it goes on. But for me, it's kind of hard to pick between, you know, the first half of the movie and the second half. Which, if you haven't seen it, you're obviously confused with that statement. But I guess, you know, I did really enjoy the fact that the end of this movie was a complete surprise to me. Like, I thought, you know, the whole movie, it was just going to be based on, like, you know, 1666. So I was also a little confused into that, because obviously there was big cliffhangers before, questions that needed answered, and I didn't think we were going to get answers this way. But I was pleasantly surprised that we did, and it ended the way it did, because it didn't just end that movie, you know, answering the questions that came up in that movie, but also answering questions that we had before. So I really did like the ending of this movie. but it's hard for me to pick between because I just enjoy the first half of the movie, the type of movie that it is. I enjoy that type of horror a lot more than your slasher, thriller aspect of a horror movie. So if if I were to watch any of these movies again, the third one would probably be the one that I watch just because I enjoy that type of movie a lot more.
Yeah, I think that for me, so first of all, we'll talk big picture, like I said, but for me, when I saw the trailer for this and I saw the three films, I thought it looked like a mistake to have it go backwards from 1994 to 78 to 66 because I had no interest in a film set in 1666. And I thought maybe the first two films would build that interest. But, I mean, no. By the time we got to the end of the second film, there was no part of me that was excited to go back to 1666. And I think I've said it before on this podcast, but I'll say again, period piece movies are like the one genre I have zero interest in. There have been several movies that have been recommended to me that I haven't watched just based off the fact that they're a period piece. If a movie takes place like before 1950, it's hard for me to get invested. And yeah,
with Django Unchained being the exception.
Yes, there are definitely exceptions. There are definitely exceptions, but I just felt like it felt like an obligation in 1666. Like they had to do it. They had to explain everything, right? But it's like in 1994 you had that Scream vibe, 78 you had the Friday the 13th vibe, and then this movie is The Crucible. Like this movie is the Salem witch trials. Like I'm not trying to watch that. Like I don't really. I just did not care at all. And I will at least admit that it was able to prevent itself from being predictable. I did not predict where the story was going to go. The reveals that they did, I did not expect at all. So that part of it was entertaining. But as I've already alluded to, without getting into the spoilers, something happens halfway through this movie that I was very happy with, and then I enjoyed the second half of the movie very much. And that second half of the movie was debatably the best part, I guess you would say, of any of the trilogy. Unfortunately, it's tied to this beginning that I really just found boring, and besides a few reveals and a few plot things that I thought were cool, for the most part, I just was kind of waiting for it to be over. I knew that it wasn't going to end in 1666, like you said, because there was just too much to tie up. Like, I knew that there was going to be some type of epilogue. I did not expect it to be half of the movie, so I was happy with that.
Yeah, I will say that after watching the movie, the first half of it, the first part, was actually a big letdown for me because, like I said, I'm not sure if I said, I'm pretty sure I said already that the second half of the movie, the second part, I enjoyed a lot more in this movie. But the reason the first part was a big letdown is because I did think that the whole movie was going to be set in that. I believe the movie was somewhere around like an hour and 50 minutes to 2 hours. And, the first, 30 minutes or so, or first quarter of it, it was a lot of setup for who these characters were, like in the town and stuff. And then the second half, I felt like kind of was a little rushed and it really wasn't, scary or horror like as I would like it to be. I felt like they could have gone a lot darker in this, like in the, time set, the Salem witch trials type of thing that they were doing. And then the fact that they did spend the second half of the movie, the second part of it, in the way that they did, you weren't able to dive any deeper into that and get any darker, or get any more in depth into those characters. And so if you kind of know what I mean, I felt like it just those people, the characters that were in the first half, could have gotten a lot more twisted, a lot darker, and a lot more horror inducing of a movie. It could have been set in that time, but the fact that they had to have the second part go back to that kind of washed over the first part a bit.
Yeah. I agree with basically everything you said there. And the other thing, too, about the first part of the movie is, you know, the whole Salem witch trial thing, the Crucible. Like, there's a reason that we still read the Crucible in school. It's a timeless story. It still holds up to this day. But they didn't add anything to it. Like, it's just like, you know, that timeless story of the Crucible, of these women being accused of something by the town and they have no way of proving themselves innocent and they pay the price, and it's a terrible black mark on human history, and it's like, yeah, I don't want to watch it again. Like,
Yeah, and that's the thing. Most people know the story, or can just, like, you know, feel the vibe of what they're going
mm-hmm.
for. They don't have to spend 45 minutes explaining that story. They can be like,
Yeah.
this is what it is in 10 minutes, and be like, okay, like, that's what they're dealing with. Let's spend 40 minutes, you know, getting crazy with it. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can still have the second half of the movie do what it needs to do.
Yeah, and they did in some parts, you know, they do tie it into the lore of the trilogy. But I wish they would have just done that more. Like, just focus on tying it into the lore. Like, that's why I'm here. That's all I care about. Just use the witch trial thing as the backdrop for this, but focus completely on the lore and the story of this trilogy. It felt more 50-50. It felt like they wanted to do both. We want to tell that classic story, but also tie it into the lore. I didn't want the classic story. I know the story. Unless you're going to do something crazy, new, and interesting with it, I don't really care. And then that second part of the film really just, I mean, obviously it's the ending of the whole trilogy, but in a lot of ways it also just feels like the ending of the first film. So, like, it feels like just a, you know, you would take that and put it on the ending of the first one. So with that being said, it's not really a movie that stands on its own, even if you disconnected it. Like, if I was telling someone to watch this movie and I said, just skip the part where they're in the past, and start at the halfway point, it wouldn't make any sense as its own movie. So, with that being said, I don't think I can recommend this movie, unfortunately. I really like the ending, and I really like where the story goes and how it plays out, but I just can't really recommend it. So I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I still think I enjoyed it more than the second one, just because I really liked that ending part, and I liked how they wrapped up the trilogy, and we'll talk more about that here in a bit. But I can't recommend it because of the reasons I've said. One quick thing, though, before I forget. Gillian Jacobs is in this trilogy, and she's most highlighted in this third film. And I think she does a great job. That's all I really wanted to say about that. Okay. What do you feel?
Well, for me, I mean, I don't know if there's any sort of law or anything that goes against this, but, like, I don't think I would recommend any of these movies on their own, or even two of them. I mean, I might say, like, you know, the first two are pretty good slasher films, you could say. You know, if you want to look at it like, don't really care about the story and they're cool slasher films. Um, I might say that, but I wouldn't. I would have to recommend this. Be like, hey, it's a trilogy. Like, if you know, want to, if you're just gonna watch one, like, go ahead. But I'm gonna recommend all three of them to you, just like I would like Lord of the Rings or something like that. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna say, hey, watch Two Towers.
Yeah. Watch Return of the King. It'll make sense.
Yeah, but I would give this movie an 8 out of 10, just because, not just because, but because I enjoyed the first part just of the kind of movie it was. I wish it would have been, you know, maybe if the whole movie, whole third, like, not even third part, but if there was just a whole movie that on that one, you know, point in time, I feel like I might have liked that. You know, maybe I would give it a higher rating if, or even if they didn't have this at all and they just had, you know, they didn't have to give that backstory and they just had a third part of them trying to figure it out, you know, figure out what's going on. I could have gotten that higher rating also, but I really enjoyed both parts.
So yeah, so just to overview before we jump into spoilers. So I gave the first film a 6, or I'm sorry, a 7. I gave the second film a 4 and the third film a 5. You gave, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the first film a 6, the second film 6.5,
an 8,
an 8, and then an 8, right?
Yeah, 6.5.
So would you say, we'll both answer this, but we can start with you. Based on those ratings, would you recommend this trilogy event as a whole to somebody? And then if you want to, also give the trilogy as a whole a rating out of 10.
Yeah. I definitely would recommend this trilogy to someone. Like, I mean, really, I would have to go looking for someone who hasn't in my close, friend group that hasn't already seen it because I've talked to plenty of people about it already, and they have seen all three. Um, but I would definitely recommend it. I definitely think it's something new. Like I said at the very beginning, it's really hard to find something new, not only that has already been made, but especially to come up with something, as new as this, a new way of doing things, um, is definitely, very interesting. And obviously, years down from now, it's not going to be like, you know, as cool to be like, yeah, these three movies came out in 3 weeks, like one after each other. Like that's not going to mean anything like years from now or anything like that. But just the way that it plays out and everything. Um, One thing I can point out is like some of my favorite movies. One, for example, being Pulp Fiction. Just the way it plays out with it hopping back and forth through time and just explaining things, like explaining the movie in a very new and creative way. I feel like that it was very similar to how these three movies played out, and I really enjoyed that. I'm very glad I didn't have to wait 3 to 6 years to watch all three of these movies. And so, with that being said, I'd give the trilogy as a whole an 8 out of 10.
All right, and just a quick update. But you saying you have to wait 3 to 6 years. I was reading a little bit more. Originally in theaters, they were set to premiere over the summer, one in each month. So one in June, one in July, one in August. Still pretty close to each other though.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah.
but I would say that for the trilogy, because the first one was as strong as it was to me, and I liked the ending of the trilogy and how they wrapped it up, that would be enough for me to forgive the middle portion of it. Because the second film, when I like what I said when I talked about that one, the second film still has a lot in there that you have fun with. I just don't think that stands alone as a movie, as a good horror movie on its own. And then the third one, I would completely, I would chop at least half of that first part out of there. But if I was recommending this to someone, I would recommend it. So I would give this a 6 out of 10 as a trilogy. I would just tell them, hey, there's this Fear Street trilogy. I really like the first one. Check that out. If you want to watch more, there are 2 more sequels, but I would definitely recommend that first one. But as a trilogy, I would overall recommend it, so 6 out of 10. If there is ever a physical release of this, like in a box set Blu-ray, I probably would purchase it. Not only because of how much, not just because of liking it, but also just the uniqueness of this film trilogy event. It's something I would like to own. Because I think it's cool when they do unique stuff like this, and it's not complete shit. Like it actually turned, like they made 3 movies at the same time, and they were actually pretty decent. So that's hard to do, I imagine. So we are going to jump into spoilers at this point. If you haven't seen any of the 3 films and you still want to watch them, maybe you're in the middle of the trilogy, haven't finished, whatever the case is, we're going to be jumping into full spoilers on all 3 films now. So if you haven't and you want to watch those, stop it here, come back, or if you've already watched them or you don't care and you're not going to watch them, you can continue with the episode. Devin, I think the best way to go about it would probably be to start off just any moments individually that you really enjoyed or really hated, either way, that you couldn't talk about without spoilers. Is there anything that jumps to mind for you?
Well, yeah, the first thing that jumps to mind just thinking about this is always going to be uh, how I think the character was played by Julia Raywald in the first movie when she gets thrown through the meat slicer. I'm pretty sure that
Yes.
was her character.
Yes.
Um, that was that was like the highlight of the movie. I mean, while I like, shied away from it very quickly and was like, "Oh hell no." Like that was definitely what made that like concreted that movie as like, rated R. If you try to think, or if I try to think in the future like, what was that movie like? Pretty gory? Was it like kid friendly? I'm gonna remember that scene and be like, "Oh no, that was some dark shit right there."
Yeah, I gotta agree. That was one of the first things I was gonna say too, and part of the reason I love the first movie so much. genuinely shocked. I had gotten to the point where I fully believed all the four main characters were going to survive. And then when he's putting her into the meat grinder and puts her head through the meat grinder, I was like, what? I was just like shocked. And then right after that, the dude is like, I forget the guy's name. I'll have to look it up real quick. But Simon, he's like shocked by her death. He's like, what the heck? And then boom, axe right to the head. And he's dead. I thought Josh was going to die too at that point. I'm like, everyone's dying except the main character.
Yeah, because Josh like was right in front of him basically, and like saw that happen. I was like, oh great, like now he's gonna die, and I'm really gonna like get pissed off.
Yeah. Plus, there were three killers in that movie. There was the skull mask killer from the beginning of the film. There was the one from 1978, the masked killer, and then there was the girl with the scissors or whatever. So I thought each one of them were going to get one kill on one of the kids, but they ended up not killing him. He survived. But yeah, that really shocked me, and I agree with you. Really stepped it up for me. Is really left a strong impression, and the fact that they never went back on that, even when they wrap up the trilogy, they're not like, oh, we somehow made it to where everything's reset to back at the first night and everyone's alive. Like, no, those characters are dead when we come back at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty crazy to me. Another moment that I really enjoyed was the opening scene of the first movie. Very strong. So have you seen Scream, the original?
I've seen a couple. I have seen the original too.
Okay, so in the original Scream opening scene has Drew Barrymore, very famous actress, dies, gets killed in the opening of the movie Scream. It's a very iconic scene because like no one expected that to happen. And it's also just a great scene. This definitely gave me vibes of that with Maya Hawke. You have, not that she's super famous or anything, but you have like this, kind of well-known actress from Stranger Things. You think she's going to be in this film trilogy, gets killed immediately in the first scene. And just the way the scene played out, it had very much Scream vibes. Really enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, that was nice because I had seen that clip of from the first Scream movie like probably 100 times before I actually sat down and watched the movie, so I already knew it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And then when I watched this movie, I had no idea what to expect and everything, and then like I didn't even put together that like the killer was that kid until obviously he like took actually when he took the mask off, I still didn't know who he was because like I just didn't understand what was going on, but I was not expecting her to die. And then the cop just shoots him right in the forehead, and then the movie starts basically. And I was like, that's pretty good opening.
Yeah, and the fact that we find this out obviously way later, but that Sheriff Nick Good ends up being the villain of the whole trilogy. He's the one that possesses these people to do these things by sacrificing them. So it only makes sense that he's the one that shows up and kills that killer. I thought Nick Good as a character was also one of the highlights of the trilogy. I did not expect him to be the villain at all when that was revealed. When they were in 1666, I started thinking like this guy's kind of suspect. But throughout the whole trilogy, that never crossed my mind that the sheriff was going to be the big villain of the trilogy, and the actual story of his descendant back in the day making this pledge with this deal with the devil, and then his family carrying it on for generations. Like, I started to get a little worried. I was like, oh, this is going to be like really over the top. Like, this guy has lived for hundreds of years, right, and lived all these lifetimes and hasn't aged. But no, it was like literally his descendants. They have the one shot showing the family tree with all the relatives stemming from Solomon who made that deal. I thought that was all... It's such a small part of the trilogy and the lore, but I really enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because I thought the exact same thing. Like, I thought that Solomon was Nick Good and that he just, like, never aged or whatever and just, like, got more modern with the times and everything. And then I'm pretty sure they do have some sort of flashback in the third movie where it shows him and I think Sydney or Ziggy as a kid at summer camp in the second movie, and you like, if you hadn't realized already, that's Nick Good.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I thought that same thing, and then I found out that it was like a whole family
Yeah.
tradition, basically.
And then it gives
But
context to the ending of that second movie where she's, Ziggy's in the stretcher and she's telling Nick, like, this is real and all this stuff. And then Nick's just like, she's just a crazy, shady sider. When you watch that second movie, you're thinking, like, oh, he just doesn't believe her. She thought he was different, but he's not. But no, he knows it's real. Because he knows the whole thing. Like, his family's the cause of it. So that's why he has to cut ties with her. So, yeah, really enjoyed that character.
And then, like you said earlier, with this whole trilogy, every movie basically keeps you guessing, and really you has a lot of twists and turns that are very unexpected. And that's one of the things I really liked, is that they could have kept it simple and had a simple storyline, like even with the third movie, like until they got to the part where it was Solomon who made the deal. Like, I thought for sure the witch was gonna like go steal the book, make the whole deal and everything, because that's what they had her going up to do. And then like it turned out to be Solomon, and that just like completely was unexpected to me. So I really liked all the twists and turns in the movie, and they all got me.
Yeah, like, you think she's the villain this whole time. Not only was she framed, but like, she's not behind any of it. Like, she's not behind the monsters coming to life. Like, that's all, the good family. And I love that phrase at the end where they're like, good is evil, and then it's like written everywhere, good is evil. Great play on words. And just the whole ending sequence at the mall with the glowing, I think they made like fake blood or something, or used someone's blood, and it was like glowing like I can't even think of the word, like neon or whatever. That whole sequence was really awesome. What did you think? Were there any of the individual, when it came to like the characters that were the killers, the supernatural characters? Were there any of them that stuck out to you, or did you find them all pretty boring? What'd you think of that?
I honestly probably like the skull mask dude from like the first movie, the opening scene, the most. I just thought he was like just like the coolest looking, killer, just like kind of like almost Scream like. So I just thought he was like, because there's like a huge dude with the big kid with the axe. Like, that's just like, okay, it's just a dude running around with an axe. And then there's the girl singing, who's like, yeah, that's like scary, but like, like she's kind of scary, but at the same time, kind of not. And then the worst one was just the small child with a baseball bat. I'm like, all right, you got like, like at the end when they like stole some of their weapons or whatever, and then like the kids coming at him with the bat, like it's showing all like them getting back up and stuff, and they're like walking towards them, and then there's this kid whacking the bat on the floor. I'm like, if I saw him, I would just be like, what the fuck,
dude. The whole trilogy, I was waiting. I'm like, he's gonna have this like moment to shine. Like, he's gonna have this one moment that's gonna be like, oh, he's actually a badass, and then it just never happens. Like, he's just like in 2 minutes of every movie. Like, I kept waiting for it, because like every other killer, for the most part, I feel like had like their moments, but then not him. He's just always in the background. I think visually he looked really cool. Like this little kid, he had like a baby mask on with the baseball bat. It's like a smaller dude. Like, visually it could have been something cool, but they just did not use him at all.
Yeah. But I would say, like, I'd say the coolest thing about the killers, slashers, and everything was that, well, the one thing that I really did like is in the first movie, now I can't remember correctly if like when they burned them all, did they all turn into one creature, or did they all turn like just like form back into themselves? Because for some reason I remember them like turning into one thing.
Well, they all get summoned from like that goop that was under the ground. I can't remember exactly what happened when they all. So I think when Nick Good was,
they trapped him in the bathroom. Well, they trapped in the first movie. They trapped them all in the bathroom.
Yeah, and they all blew up, and then the goop just like summons them. So they're all from the same like thing, but yeah, it just like, I don't know exactly what to describe it as, but yeah, they all come from that like weird pile of goop in the area where the seance is. But that was a cool moment too, when they all get killed. And they do blow them up, and their plan works, and they all just come right back to life. It was one of those like, oh, we're like in way over our head, we're screwed moments. A lot of it did though borderline on not believable for me. Like for example, the Samantha, the possessed girlfriend. You know, she becomes possessed at the end of the first film, spends the entirety of the trilogy up until the very end possessed, and like their answer is just like, oh, we'll just tie her up to whatever object is near us, like as if it's no big deal. Like that seems very difficult. This is like a possessed person that's trying to kill you. It's kind of like what bothers me most about zombie movies is when like they don't take the zombie threat that seriously. I just kind of felt the same way, like they weren't taking it that seriously. So that was a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
feel
weird.
like it was also like it was like half, like basically she was just there as like, you know, part of their goal to like get
Mm-hmm.
her back. And then the other half, the reason that she was there is for like comic relief. Like they just basically made fun of her, like when I think they like punched her or something, and uh the one girl was like, I've been wanting to do that all day or something. Uh but I think it was Sydney, I think it was her name. Um but yeah, I felt like she should have been more of a possessed person, but I feel like what she was actually just like more zombie like, which didn't make much sense.
Yeah, and then in the second movie, the ending of that movie with the two sisters, Cindy getting killed by the uh, killers, I did not see that coming at all. And the way they were both just like basically killed laying on the lawn like that. Eventually, Sadie does get revived by Nick Good, I believe. Um,
Hmm.
and I can't remember exactly. There was something there that I'm forgetting. But anyway, that ending was very striking and surprising to me as well. Just the whole way that was shot. I talked about the cinematography already, but the way it was shot, the way it pans up and they're both lying dead, killed there on the grass. Like, they were able to do that because of what the trilogy was. But it's so rare in a horror movie that you see that, right? Like, just all of your main characters failing their objective and being murdered. you know?
Yeah, especially not even like them getting murdered, but because at first they had this goal and they're digging and digging and they just pick up this rock and it's just like I forget what it says, but it's like Sarah Fear, like this,
Mm-hmm.
you're cursed forever or something, and they just fail completely. And
Yeah.
then and then on top of that, they both just like get killed, and you're well, you weren't gonna run away from them forever. Like it was this
Yeah.
or you die.
Yeah.
So I like that.
Yeah, it was shocking, almost like that first one with the two characters dying. But yeah, really liked the character deaths in this one. The kills, a lot of the kills were really good. The gruesome ones were nice. uh, Definitely some good kills. I said there was one scene with that Alice character who I hated that I liked. It's her death scene. I love the fact that they're her, Cindy, and I think one other character, I think Ziggy, are like in a cabin. They give this huge speech about, she's like, I've lost everything in my life, I'm gonna do this, blah blah blah, and then she turns around and just gets axed and just killed immediately. um I didn't just enjoy it because her character was killed. I thought it was done really well, and the performance there, it played really well. You think it's this big, inspiring thing, and then it just gets killed. That's how the whole trilogy was. It just kept turning things on its head. It was, kept you on your toes the whole time, which I think that's definitely one of the strengths of it.
Yeah, for sure. One of the last things I just want to point out was like the huge beating heart that was like in the whatever you call them, the tunnels,
Yeah, that was like the
or
goop. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, that was definitely like when that came up in the second movie when they went down there and found that, like that was just like probably, I mean it wasn't like scary or anything, but it was definitely like, you know, like it was a character on its own. And when you can make like basically an inanimate object like be somewhat of a character because it shows up, more and more and stuff, but like when you can make something like that, which honestly doesn't even play that big of a part in the movie. Like it's not like they had to like stab the heart or anything, which I like thought about many times. Like, why don't they just like burn that thing, or like maybe try that, maybe try like axing that thing. But they kind of just like don't mind it. They're just like, ew, gross. Like, not even gonna look at it. But I thought that was like a very interesting part of it.
yeah, absolutely. And then, thematically, there was one moment I really liked. So in the third movie, in the first part, Solomon is chasing Sarah Fear, through the tunnels, and he's like calling out to her, and he's like, Sarah, Sarah, chasing her to try to kill her. Flip it then in the second part, same actors but different characters, and Dina is chasing Sheriff Good through those same tunnels, and she's calling out Nick, to kill him. Really liked that thematic switch there of the the callbacks earlier in the movie. I did enjoy. That's probably the only thing about the 1666 that I enjoyed was that callback later on in the film. Yeah, anything else you have to say about these before we wrap up?
I would just have to say that I'd like to see something like this in the future. I hope it's not. Obviously it was very creative, and I wouldn't want a copycat or anything like that, but just in sort of this creative, fun way of doing something like this. I definitely like to see. We've seen, and that's one of the things that gets brought up is we've seen 1,000 horror slasher films that are the copycats of the classics, or just copycats of a basic slasher film, and this definitely takes it a different way. Just like I know you've seen the movie It Follows. That was a completely different twist and turn on a slasher horror film, and I feel like even though this had its classic slasher moments in it and stuff, it was definitely something brand new. And I just encourage people to go that route, unless they think they can make the greatest classic slasher movie that there is.
Yeah, I would say biggest thing that stuck out to me was the director, Lee Janiak. She, as far as movies go, directed a horror film in 2014 called Honeymoon, which I have not seen or heard of, and then directed all 3 of these films. So just kind of plucked out of obscurity, and I think she did a great job. So I'm definitely going to try to go back and check out that first film. Would definitely be interested in anything that she directs in the future. And then also Netflix just has this weird thing. It's like it's almost becoming like a thing. I feel like it's like the Netflix effect. Like, I swear to God, if I wouldn't have never known that about the production story behind the scenes, like, didn't this just feel like a Netflix project? Like, the cast is a lot of people who have been in Netflix things. Just the way it looks and the way it just seems like something that Netflix would make. And then it turns out they didn't even make the movie. So it's like, it's just really weird to me how I feel like every time it's like you watch something on Netflix, it has like that Netflix feel. Almost like when you watch a Disney or a Pixar film or maybe a Marvel film, like they have their specific feels. It's just very odd how Netflix is like growing this almost like brand to where you can just kind of tell what kind of movie or a TV show or whatever, it's going to be. I just find that interesting.
But have you ever seen the movie Babysitter? I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. It just had the sequel like a year ago.
Yes, I watched the first one when the sequel came out.
I'm pretty sure those are Netflix films, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first thing I thought of when I saw this. Even like just the font, the cover photo for it, and everything, the poster. And like I said, I didn't know any sort of marketing beforehand. I literally opened Netflix and decided to watch this movie. So that's exactly was my thought process. I was like, okay, this is a Netflix slasher film. Let's watch it, and then that's basically how I went into it.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us for this special episode. We didn't have a theme this month. I've had some things going on in my life, and I just had to take some time off from my hobbies. But we will be returning next month, and our theme will be anime films, starting with the film Your Name. So come back the first week of August, either on our podcast, any podcast platform, or if you're watching us here on YouTube. That episode actually won't be on YouTube because we already recorded it. But after that, we'll return to YouTube. And we're going to be doing anime films for the month of August. So join us for that. Devin, anything else?
Just thanks for watching, or thanks for listening to this. And stay tuned because, like we said earlier, I feel like the movie world's about to get pretty crazy.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, whether it's your first time or you're returning. Thank you for listening or watching, and we hope we inspired you to watch more movies.